Greetings, my name is Bill, and I am the Snarky Apologist. This video is, it's to show proof positive. And you can use this as reference, for showing people that, yes, indeed, the Watchtower Society does lie to its followers. It does indeed misrepresent their sources to their followers to present their doctrines, but it's never a good thing to lie. To anybody, and especially if you call yourself God's organization and you're lying to your own followers, even more so. But you get the idea. All right, eventually I'm going to have a link. I'm going to have some pages on the Snarky Apologist info blog, which is a resource I've set up to provide you folks with resources and information you need to see truth of a false prophet misrepresenting organization. So without further ado, let's get into it. All right, now to begin with, you might hear some pounding because I'm having some carpeting being put in, so that's the installers doing their thing. Now, I'm going to show some quotes in the Trinity booklet and then show what the writers actually said so you can see for yourself how it's been taken out of context. All right, we can't cover all quotes, so I'm just going to cover some of them. We'd be here forever if we had to. Beyond the grasp of human reason, on page 4 it states, this confusion is widespread. The Encyclopedia Americana notes that the doctrine of the Trinity is considered to be, quote, beyond the grasp of human reason. All right, now here's the full quote. It is held that although the doctrine is beyond the grasp of human reason, it is, like many of the formulations of physical science, not contrary to reason, and may be apprehended, though it may not be comprehended by the human mind. That's just God being God. Now, the booklet also goes on to talk about how it was formulated by an intrusion of Greek philosophies and metaphysics and mishmashed together and put in the blender. Well, the article actually dictates against that. It goes on to state, it is probably a mistake to assume that the doctrine resulted from the intrusion of Greek metaphysics or philosophy into Christian thought, for the data upon which the doctrine rests and also its earliest attempts at formulation are much older than the Church's encounter with Greek philosophy. So the source they are quoting from actually speaks against what they're trying to put forth. Now on page 5 they state, a Protestant publication states, the word Trinity is not found in the Bible, ... It did not find a place formally in the theology of the Church until the 4th century. Quoted from the Illustrated Bible Dictionary. There's a few things to show you from the Illustrated Bible Dictionary to show what they're actually saying. The word Trinity is not found in the Bible. And you remember the ellipsis, the ... Yeah, here's what's behind it. And though used by Tertullian in the last decade of the 2nd century, which, by the way, as an aside, they deny later in the book. Anyway, it did not find a place formally in the theology of the Church till the 4th century. It is, however, the distinctive and all-comprehensive doctrine of the Christian faith. Now that right there blows it out of the water, but let's continue. It makes 3 affirmations that there is but one God, that the Father, the Son, and the Spirit is each God, and that the Father, the Son, and the Spirit is each a distinct person. In this form, it has become the faith of the Church since it received its full formulation at the hands of Tertullian, Athanasius, and Augustine. I think Tertullian, Athanasius, and Augustine, I think they were a law firm back then. Now, let's continue. There's some more from the Illustrated Bible. They go on to state, though it is not a biblical doctrine in the sense that any formulation of it can be found in the Bible, it can be seen to underlie the revelation of God, implicit or being implied in the Old Testament and explicit or being explained in the New Testament. By this we mean that though we cannot speak confidently of the revelation of the Trinity in the Old Testament, yet once the substance of the doctrine has been revealed in the New Testament, we can read back many implications of it in the Old Testament. See, in other words, what they're saying is, even though the formulation is not spelled out, ABC, in the Old Testament, when you read the New Testament, you can read back into the Old and see how it's being applied. And they go on and state, but even the opening pages of the Old Testament we are taught to attribute the existence and persistence of all things to a threefold source. There are passages where God, His Word, and His Spirit are brought together, as for example in a narrative of the creation where Elohim is seen to create by means of His Word and Spirit. You see how they're giving supportive statements for what they're stating? Completely opposite of what the Watchtower is making them say. All right, and finishing off this source, they close by saying, by way of contrast, it must be remembered that the Old Testament was written before the revelation of the doctrine of the Trinity was clearly given, and the New Testament after it. Clearly what the Watchtower is not saying. All right, next up, and the New Catholic Encyclopedia also says, the doctrine of the Holy Trinity is not taught in the Old Testament. Now, go ahead and read this. I just want to highlight a few things. The doctrine of the Holy Trinity is not taught in the Old Testament. But then it states in the New Testament, the oldest evidence is in the Pauline epistles. And it goes on. In the Old Testament, the mystery of the Holy Trinity was not revealed to the chosen people of the Old Testament. Blah, blah, blah. Read on. Read this whole thing. But I found it interesting at the second part where it says, in the New Testament. And they state, the revelation of the truth of the triune life of God was first made in the New Testament, where the earliest references to it are in the Pauline epistles. The doctrine is most easily seen in St. Paul's recurrent use of the terms God, Lord, and Spirit. What makes the use of these terms so significant is that they appear against a strictly monotheistic background. Now, do you see how somebody could say, when you take a verse from here and a verse from there and piece it together to make it say something completely different, that's misrepresenting. See, when you could take the article and it says, you know, the revelation of the truth of the triune life of God was first made in the New Testament, I could say, you know what? This article supports my theory that the revelation of the truth of the triune life of God was made in the New Testament. And I'd be right. But do you see how clever they are? That's why they pulled us off the racks. You can't get this book anymore. All right, now we go back to page 6, where we read, the New Encyclopedia Britannica observes neither the word Trinity nor the explicit doctrine appears in the New Testament. Go ahead and freeze frame this and read this. Neither the word Trinity nor the explicit doctrine appears in the New Testament. What else does it say? Thus, the New Testament established the basis for the doctrine of the Trinity. I don't see anything in there about paganism or Greek metaphysics. I do see them saying that the New Testament established the basis for the doctrine of the Trinity. Not quite what the Watchtower would like you to believe, is it? Next up, we have Bernhard Loos says, in A Short History of Christian Doctrine, quote, as far as the New Testament is concerned, one does not find in it an actual doctrine of the Trinity. In the same source, Bernhard states this, as far as the New Testament is concerned, one does not find in it an actual doctrine of the Trinity. This does not mean very much, however, for generally speaking, the New Testament is less intent upon setting forth certain doctrines than it is upon proclaiming the kingdom of God, a kingdom that dawns in and with the person of Christ. At the same time, however, there are in the New Testament the rudiments of a concept of God that was susceptible of further development and clarification along doctrinal lines. Now, there's a couple other statements from the same source. Here's another one. It would follow, therefore, that he could also use the word God for Christ. In other passages of the New Testament, the predicate God is without a doubt applied to Christ. With these affirmations, which for Jewish monotheism was utterly offensive, Christians expressed their faith that it was not merely some heavenly being, Michael, which encountered them in Jesus Christ, but God himself. And that because of this, his coming, especially his cross and his resurrection, held meaning for the entire world. Furthermore, Bernhard, as a resource and researcher, also discovers this. The first and most important reason for the fuller elaboration of confession, as well as for the development of doctrine, at least at the beginning, is the fact that very soon after the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, the primitive community began to pray to its exalted Lord. This is a fact, the significance of which can hardly be overestimated. And if that wasn't enough for you, he goes on to state that hence the development of the dogma of the Trinity and of Christology has its beginnings in the early days of the church, even though it took a long time before a doctrine was actually formulated, which cuts against the grain of the Watchtower continuing to say that it was the intrusion of Greek metaphysics and Christian philosophy and mishmash this and mash that. And they're speaking against that. Now, Bernhard Loos is probably not a Trinitarian. He's a theologian. He's a scholar. But you know what? You don't have to believe it. You just got to quote him accurately. All right? You don't have to believe. It's one thing to believe something. It's another thing to not believe it. And it's still a third to not believe it and then misrepresent it. And that's what the Watchtower is doing. And to close out the quotes from Bernhard Loos, he states, "It is true that the proposition that Jesus Christ is God had long been held. We meet its beginnings already in the New Testament." Yeah. Why didn't the Watchtower quote this? You see how deceived? That's why they had to get this off the presses and out of the hands of thinking people. Now, back on page 6, they're quoting Yale University professor E. Washburn Hopkins, who states, "To Jesus and Paul, the doctrine of the Trinity was apparently unknown. ... They say nothing about it." All right. Oops, left this one off. The beginning of the doctrine of the Trinity appears already in John. To Jesus and Paul, the doctrine of the Trinity was apparently unknown. At any rate, they say nothing about it. But when did the doctrine begin? That's right. Yeah, with the writings of John. Now, how reliable of a resource is this E. Washburn Hopkins? Well, he trashes all of Christianity. Notice that this Yale professor said in another one of his books, quote, "Finally, the life, temptation, miracles, parables, and even the disciples of Jesus have been derived directly from Buddhism." Now, if you'll notice, the only ones that the Watchtower can find that will say that the Trinity is of pagan origin are atheist and Christian trashers. Yet even E. Washburn Hopkins admits that John taught the Trinity. You see the quality of the resources that the Watchtower is using? What they don't tell you is that most of these people are quoting disagree with the Watchtower's teachings as well. For instance, historian Arthur Weigel. Now, this is their star witness in this magazine. They quote him more than anybody else. Notes, Jesus Christ never mentions such a phenomenon, and nowhere in the New Testament does the word Trinity appear. The idea was only adopted by the Church 300 years after the death of our Lord, in his book, The Paganism in Our Christianity. Well, here's what Arthur Weigel also holds to.